Good evening, everyone. I am Elephant Happy and Peacock Proud that you are with us tonight. It makes me hippopotamus glad to have you here with us. Certainly you could have been on any particular Zoom at this moment, or you could have been doing anything at this particular juncture, but you are here with us, and we're so appreciative of that. My name is the Reverend Vernon Walker, and among the many roles and many hats that I wear and many roles that I fulfill, tonight I am in the capacity as the program, I'm wearing the hat as a program manager of the Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or otherwise known as CREW. And simply put, our objective is to prepare people for extreme weather, to prepare people across the Bay State in an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable manner for climate resilience. But we'll get more into CREW a little bit later. Just wanted to share that a little bit with you. But it gives me great pleasure and a great delight to have our dear brother in the struggle, and who has been a long-time advocate for climate justice and world-renowned author and scholar related to climate justice and many other issues that he has tackled. We are so glad to have we are so glad to have Bill McKibben with us. And as many of you know who he is and the work that he has done, I just want to read a little bit of his bio, his very extensive bio. But for those who may not be familiar with Bill, I will read as such. Bill McKibben is a founder and senior advisor emeritus of 350.org. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change and has appeared in 24 languages. He has gone on to write many more books, and his work appears regularly in periodicals from the New Yorker to the Rolling Stone. He serves as the Schulman Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Millbury College, as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and he has won the Gandhi Peace Prize, as well as many honorary degrees from over 18 colleges and universities. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, sometime called the Alternative Nobel, and the Swedish Parliament Foreign Policy named him to its inaugural list of 100 of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. Bill McKibben helped found 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, and has organized on every continent, including the Antarctica, for climate action. He played a leading role in launching the opposition to big oil pipeline projects and fossil fuel divestment campaign, which has become the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history, with endowments worth more than 15 trillion stepping back from oil, gas, and coal. He stepped down as the board chair of 350 in 2015 and left the board and stepped down from his volunteer role as senior advisor in 2020, accepting emeritus status. So again, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Bill, and I'm hippopotamus glad that he is with us tonight, and I am eagle proud and elephant happy that he is with us on tonight. Well, I want to bring him and turn it over to him, but before we do that, matter of fact, let's turn it over to you, Bill, and then we'll ask the first question. Let's turn it over to you.
Well, first of all, Reverend Walker, what a pleasure to be with you, and what a pleasure to be on this call. And I see a few old friends and many new ones, and it's really a pleasure. And it's a pleasure for me up here in Vermont I feel like I'm spending the whole day in Boston. I got to spend the lunch hour on WGBH with Jim Browdy and Marjorie Egan, and that was fun. And then after this, I get to go do a thing on Zoom with Senator Markey, a big rally heading into the election. So, my roots are in Massachusetts, so it's fun for me to get to spend a day there, even if it's only electronically. Let's just, as we begin just thinking about this topic, and especially about extreme weather, let's just make sure that we have in our hearts people all over the world tonight who are dealing with what happens when you overheat a planet. Across the Southeast, there's 5 million or more people without power after Hurricane Zeta. We're deep into the Greek alphabet now, having exhausted the normal one. In California, the winds have died down a little bit, but 5 of the 10 largest wildfires in the state's history are still burning. The 2 largest wildfires in Colorado history are ablaze at the moment and threatening to combine into one. And that's just in the 1% of the planet that's the continental US. It's obviously much worse in other parts of the world. Think particularly tonight of our brothers and sisters in Vietnam, where they're dealing with absolutely epic flooding that's killed a lot of people. And I've been talking with my colleagues there the last couple of days, and it's really brutal. Let me just, maybe just as we get going for a minute, just kind of situate us where we are, Reverend Walker. As you said in that kind introduction, I wrote the first book about climate change way back in 1989. And at the time, we were issuing warnings about what would happen if we didn't do anything, and then we didn't do anything. So now, we're dealing with the bulletins from the front line, as it were. We've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree Celsius. That's caused the dislocations we've seen. That's been enough to melt about half the sea ice in the summer Arctic and kill about half the world's coral reefs and discombobulate the way that water moves around the planet. And it's pretty terrible already. But the really terrible thing is we're on a path now on sort of current trajectories, to raise the temperature of the planet 3 or 3.5 degrees Celsius, 6, 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And if we do that or anything like it, the damage is not going to be 3 times as bad now. It's going to be a lot worse than that, because you go past tipping points. There's no plan for refreezing the Arctic once it melts, And so our job, it seems to me, is to do everything we can first to keep us from getting any hotter than we have to get, to make the very rapid change so that we don't heat up any more than we need to. And then to take care of as much of the damage as we can that we can no longer stop. We need to adapt to that which we can no longer prevent, and we desperately need to prevent that to which there is no adaptation. And so that's our kind of twin task. And I think that we have a stronger sense, Vernon, this year in particular, of what all that means. Stronger for 2 reasons. One, because of the pandemic. It should, I think, is teaching Americans something that seems obvious and trite, but that we forget, which is simply that, physical reality is real. It's easy to forget that when you live staring into a screen all day, like many of us do. But I've been trying to convince people for 3 decades that, physics and chemistry don't compromise. And the microbe is doing a good job of teaching us that lesson for biology. Does not matter if our blessed president gets up there and says that it's all a hoax, or it's going to go away by Easter or whatever. Doesn't matter what he says, because he's not in charge. The microbe's in charge. If it says stand 6 feet apart and wear a mask, then stand 6 feet apart and wear a mask, period. End of story. That's, in our version of creation, that's how things work. Second thing, corollary to the first, sometimes speed really matters. If the pandemic taught us anything, our We got our first case of COVID in the United States on the same day in January that the South Koreans got their first case. The South Koreans sprung into action, man. Within days, they were testing people left and right and whatever. And so about, I think, a couple of hundred people died in Korea, and their economy is more or less back in working order and so on and so forth. We didn't do anything. We just, as is now clear from good reporting by people like Bob Woodward, we knew there was a problem at the highest levels, but we didn't do a darn thing about it. We just sat on our thumbs. And so, we know the result. A completely shattered economy, an enormous and unnecessary pile of dead bodies, and an incredible amount of grief and sadness and loneliness and anxiety and stress. We're coming up on a Thanksgiving that's not going to be a Thanksgiving. And that's really hard. For climate, instead of February and March, we have the last 30 years when we've ignored plain spoken warnings from the scientific community and done nothing. We have to move very quickly now. We have to cram the work of what should have been 4 decades into 1 decade, but the pandemic has taught us how important that speed can be. Third thing, most important, it seems to me, is that we're reminded now daily about the importance of solidarity. You're a young man, but I grew up kind of in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan, and this idea that markets were going to solve all problems and that government was the problem, not the solution. And Reagan would always get up and say, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Ha ha ha. It turns out the scariest words in the English language are, "We've run out of ventilators," or "the hillside behind your house just caught on fire." And you can't do a damn thing about them, with market forces. You have to build societies and governments that are able to respond to the needs of people and address them. And this latter point about solidarity seems to me to have been just underlined and amplified 1,000 times over in the course of this year. I mean, when we look back on 2020, and hopefully we will look back on it, it seems like it will never end, but one trusts it will eventually. The most important thing that anybody said in 2020 was what Mr. Floyd said as he was being murdered. Said, "I can't breathe." And, people can't breathe because there's a cop kneeling on their neck or a racist police department that's stifling their community, or they can't breathe because there's a coal-fired power plant or a compressor station or something in their neighborhood, and it's usually the same neighborhoods. They can't breathe because COVID is filling up their lungs with fluid, and we know that that follows the same lines of race and class as everything else. People can't breathe because there's so much wildfire smoke in the air that authorities on the West Coast are telling people to go inside their house and tape the windows shut so they're not breathing the particulates. People can't breathe just because it's gotten too damn hot. The United States in August saw the highest reliably recorded temperature in the history of planet Earth, 130 degrees Fahrenheit in California. 130 degrees is at the very edge of what a human can survive, even for a little while, but it's going to become, all the computer models show, a pretty common temperature across very large swaths of the planet within the next few decades as temperatures keep rising, unless we're able to stop very soon. So, this is ultimately a question both of science. Climate change is kind of a math problem in some ways, how much carbon you put in the air. And it's a deep, deep problem of justice. The iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and harder you get hit. So we need to address things on all these levels. And that's why I'm so, happy with the group that you've assembled and the people that are working hard on these things every day. It's really good to have people thinking about how we prevent and deal with extreme weather before it happens, not after it happens, which is how we usually address these things.
And thank you for opening as such. And you touched on so many different critical topics. And we got a lot to unpack in a little bit of time that we have. And also, we want to open it up for Q&A before we end our program. But one of the things that you've mentioned that protrudes out in my mind is how when we look at COVID-19, we look at climate injustice, we look at racial injustice, we look at indigenous injustice. There is a commonality that those who are disproportionately hurt are people of color, low-income communities, low-income, low-wealth communities, and coastal communities. And these communities are disproportionately affected by all these crises. And it's interesting because sometimes people who make social justice their mission will categorize climate justice as some isolated thing because, the environmental justice movement has historically been white dominated. But the reality of it is that it intersects with all these other issues. As you were mentioning, the communities of color, unfortunately, have some of the highest asthma rates across the country because there's a power plant not too far. There's an electrical grid not too far. There's a compressor station not too far. And then when we look at policing, we understand the mass incarceration, and as Michelle Alexander pointed out in her book that is just really eye-popping, Jim Crow and the Age of Color Blindness, mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow and the Age of Color Blindness. We understand that Black and brown folks are disproportionately locked up. We, as America, make up 30% of the world's population. We make up 5% of the world's population, but 30% of the prison population. And that's atrocious because we have folks who are investing in prisons, and we have prison privatization, and it's certainly detrimental to everyone, but disproportionately Black and brown. As you mentioned, you raised, about Floyd, and it's very clear how racial justice is connected to climate justice, because as we mentioned, there's environmental racism and that again, disproportionately affects folks of color. And I think that in order for things to change, and we can get into that in a little bit, there's going to be a coalescence. There's need to be a coalition built, Black, white, and brown coming together, people of faith and people of no faith, people of goodwill, people of moral conscience coming together, saying enough is enough. And I really believe that's what Dr. King was fighting for in the Poor People's Campaign, to unite folks, and that's why he was in Memphis, advocating on the behalf of sanitation workers and standing in solidarity with them because they were paid unfair wages and treated less than human. But to backtrack a little bit, I would love to know, and I'm sure some of these folks would love to know on the call, what originally interested you in climate justice movement? What originally interests you and engaging in climate change work? Would really love to hear some of the origins of that.
Sure. I mean, they're kind of odd in a way. Environmentalism was not the thing that I spent my time with when I was a very young person. When I get out of college, my first job out of college was as a writer in New York City for the New Yorker magazine. And this was in the very early 1980s, right when homelessness was first a kind of issue that we were talking about. The first wave of people, back actually when we still thought of homelessness as something unusual that, was going to go away, as a crisis or something. Sadly now, I think we've just come to accept it as a part of urban life, but it shouldn't be and needn't be. So I was doing a lot of reporting about that and a lot of activism around it too. I lived on the streets for a while in order to write about it, and then started homeless shelters in my church, and actually met my wife, who was doing work in the same thing. So that was, if you'd asked me at the age of 22 or 23 what I was going to spend my life doing, it probably would have had a lot to do with those kind of issues. But then I wrote a long piece for the New Yorker magazine about where everything in my apartment came from in New York. Followed all the line, Con Ed was buying oil from Brazil, so I went down there, and they were getting electricity from a big hydro dam up in Hudson Bay, so I went up there, and out in the garbage barges into New York Harbor and along the New York City water supply system way up into upstate New York, and on and on and on. And by the time I was done with that, it took me about a year to do it, I had a much deeper sense of the physicalness of the world and kind of its vulnerability and its fragility. I was a good child of suburban and urban life, and really those are sort of designed to make you forget where anything comes from. Water comes from a tap, that's all you need to know. But I think that I understood more about that vulnerability, and hence when I started reading the first climate science papers that started being published in the mid 1980s, I was more attuned, I think, to what the dangers that might be coming at us were than a lot of people. And that's why I wrote The End of Nature, which was the first book about all of this. I was only 20, I guess I was 27 when I wrote it. I really had a sense that we were going to be in trouble. It wasn't quite as obvious then. You couldn't see it. It hadn't quite happened yet, but the scientists pretty much knew what was going to come. And in the course of writing that book, reporters are supposed to be objective at all times and not care about the outcomes of things, Reporter covering the elections not supposed to care who wins or whatever. But I knew as I was writing that book that I did care about the outcome of this. I didn't want the planet to overheat and, everyone get drowned by the rising sea and whatever. So, I kind of set to work. At first, that work was about more books and symposiums and talks and so on. But it took me a while to figure out that I'd kind of misunderstood what was going on. I thought we were in an argument about climate change. And when you're in an argument, then you need more data and more, but we weren't we'd won the argument within very few years. The science was completely clear. We'd won the argument. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and science. The fight was what fights are always about: money and power. And the other side in this fight, the fossil fuel industry, had so much money and hence so much power that they were just going to keep on with their business model, even if it broke the planet, which it was clearly starting to do. So that's when I really turned more from just a writer into also into a kind of volunteer activist and organizer. It's not really my, you're that way for real, Reverend Walker, but it's not my, it's not my personality exactly, or my whatever, but I turned myself enough into it that we built 350.org, which was a kind of first iteration of a big global climate movement. And we launched these fights against pipelines and the big divestment campaigns and things like that. And now, happily, there's all kinds of people flooding in: Extinction Rebellion and the wonderful Sunrise Movement with the Green New Deal, and all the high school students following Greta and all the other great leaders around the world, and all the amazing work being done by indigenous groups and so on and so forth. It makes me very, very happy to see it happening.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, there's a groundswell of support that is raising up among many different groups, many different organizations and different folks who are trying to raise the awareness of the climate emergency. And certainly the UN released a report in 2018 that says, well, we got 12 years. At that time, when they released it in 2018, we got 12 years to keep the global emission carbon rate, global emission the carbon emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or otherwise, millions of people will be in poverty. Millions of people will be infected by extreme weather. And that's another thing we wanted to really touch on. And you touched on it a bit earlier, and is this extreme weather portion. You know, we are, because of climate change has been happening since the Industrial Revolution, there is damage that has already been done. And this damage manifests itself in the form of more hurricanes and more floods and more sea level rise and more stormwater runoff, and more extreme weather events, more tornadoes, et cetera. So it's an inevitable fact that we will be dealing with these extreme weather events. And that's why I think it's important to consider what climate resiliency is about. Because at the end of the day, and you touched on it earlier, it's inescapable that we will be dealing with these weather. And me being a person of faith, I believe there's a sacred responsibility that the good Lord has put on people of faith to care and tend for the earth. In fact, our three monotheistic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, they really all point to the story of the progenitor of the human race, Adam. And that's where they point to Adam and God creating Adam. One of the things that we see with Adam is that he was a stewardship. He was to care for the earth. He was to tend to the earth. And certainly, humanity has certainly lost its way in many respects. And one of the ways that we see this manifest, and that is very clear, is that there are artificial walls that divide us. Who's this ethnicity? Who's Black? Who's white? Who's college educated? Who isn't college educated? Who lives in the city? Who doesn't live in the city? Or who lives in suburbia? Who lives in an urban community? Who drives this car? Who drives that car? Who has this political ideology? Who has that political ideology? But the reality of it is that, as Dr. King said, we're all tied into the inescapable garment of mutuality, and what affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And it is on that note that I want to dig a little deeper into some of the subjects you mentioned. And you have written a lot of books and touched on many of subjects. And you even share with us some of your thoughts in 2020 and what you're pondering. But we'd love to dig deeper and go and to unearth that a little bit more about what is on your mind nowadays. What are you pondering? What are you pondering nowadays? Where's your thoughts? Where's your thoughts leading you to these days?
Well, I got to tell you the truth. My thoughts these days are preoccupied with what's going to happen next Tuesday. It feels to me like, everybody always says, oh, this is the most important election of all, we've ever had, whatever. I think this is going to be the most important election for the next 40,000 years, because I don't think we're going to get another bite at this particular apple if we don't do something strong about climate change in the next 4 years. Look, our time is running out. It's like sand through the hourglass. And it's not, of course, just climate change. I mean, it feels to me like our democracy is at stake. And it just feels to me at some even deeper level, like just our sense of decency and civility and, common, I don't know, just feels like we're like we've got a president who's doing everything he can to split us apart and to blow things up and to make this country not work. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see people rise up and say, no, we don't want that kind of world. But I don't know. After what happened 4 years ago, it's hard to have much confidence. So, this is a nice break. I'm mostly phone banking and writing pieces and trying to turn people out and, run through the tape, as they say, um, because I think an awful lot's riding on this next election. Not that the election's going to solve anything, um, but I do think, and this is interesting in context of the election, that it is clear finally that these issues around climate change have broken through. And, you can tell this because for years, they've never asked questions about it at the debates, and the candidates never talked about it. They never ran ads. They always sort of stayed away from it. It seemed a little too dangerous. People might think they were radical or something if they talked about it. But clearly that dam's broken. I mean, Joe Biden is making his closing argument mostly about climate change. And there have been a couple of ads in the last 24 hours that he's put up that are just remarkable. And they make the point, Reverend Walker, that you were making, that this is a all of us in this together kind of fight. Now, of course, all of us aren't in it together in exactly the same way. The poorer you are, the harder you're going to get hit. And it's worth remembering that applies to this country, but it applies in spades around the world. I mean, they don't call it global warming for nothing. There was data that came out last week that showed that the richest 10% of the population of the world, which is anybody whose income is greater than $38,000 a year, that 10% is responsible for more emissions than the entire bottom half of humanity. And that's us. And people all over the world are feeling powerfully the effects of what we've done and what we're doing. So that is something I think about a lot. Of all the things that the president has done that seem to me shameful, it's hard for my mind to beat the fact that the US, which put more carbon into the atmosphere than any other, is now the only country in the world not taking part in the Paris Climate Accords, the only country in the world not trying to do something about this problem. That seems so bizarrely radical and almost crazy to me that it's hard to even imagine. So, I try to take, and I do take, great pleasure and great hope from the fact that lots and lots of people are rallying around this cause. This is the biggest movement in the world now, maybe the biggest movement ever. And it's especially powerful to see young people at its lead. The polling data in this country indicates that for young people under the age of 30 voting in this election, climate change is by far and away the most important issue for them, the thing that's turning them out in what so far seem to be record numbers. So I take great hope from that. I worry a great deal about the short time that we have to solve the problem. We're not used to problems that come with time limits. Most of the problems we face in our political system are ones we face our whole lives, and we take we do a little, something done here and come back in a few years and get a little more done, and 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 2 steps back and 1 step forward, but on we go, trying to deal with healthcare or the minimum wage or whatever it is. Climate change isn't like that. If we don't solve it very soon, we won't solve it. And that's, what sort of keeps me deeply engaged all the time. Why, I guess it's why, I keep ending up in jail or whatever, is just because it just seems like the time is so short.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you touched on political representation, and we obviously know the occupant of the White House does nothing but fan the flames of hate, of xenophobia, of meanness, of nastiness, of mudslinging. And, historically, politics has been a very negative thing. It seems in the sense that it seems like negativity is being rewarded. To step outside of the climate hat and to maybe delve a little deeper into the political matters, and obviously, Crew is not a political organization, but since we're talking a little bit politics, we have this ballot question here in Massachusetts next week that will be voted on, and that's already been voted on. There's early voting has started. Uh, Ranked choice voting,
Hmm.
and one of the arguments of ranked choice voting, which I am persuaded by, is that it would decrease negative campaigning. It would increase civility, bring civility back into politics. It would discourage negative campaigning. And there's just a particular interesting stat in Massachusetts between 1998 to 2018, 20-year period. 41% of winners for statewide races and federal races, such as congressmen, such as state representative, state senator, governor, lieutenant governor, governor's council, etc. 41% of the winners in that time frame have won with less than a majority of the vote. But ranked choice voting seeks to resolve this and solve this by letting the winner win with greater than 50% of the vote. We'd love to hear your thought or two on ranked choice voting.
I'm so glad you asked, because this is actually something I think about a little bit, and there's a reason I think about it. My first job as a newspaper reporter was covering the city of Cambridge. I was the city hall reporter for 3 or 4 years in the city of Cambridge back in the late 70s and early 80s. And city of Cambridge was the only jurisdiction in the country that was running ranked choice voting. They called it proportional representation, or PR voting. And the traditional reason people give for supporting ranked choice voting, which I think is correct, is that it allows you to vote for a third party and not be a spoiler in the election. You can vote for the Green Party, without electing George Bush or whatever, because if as is likely the Green candidate doesn't win, then they pass their ballots on to whoever you voted number 2 for. But I think you hit on the real genius of this thing, which, having watched it close up, is that it kind of ratchets you towards a certain amount of civility. If I'm running for something, and I have a feeling that I'm going to want to get some of your number 2 votes if you're eliminated someplace during the counting process, then I better not be a jackass to you during the campaign. I'm going to have to be a little bit civil and polite. And that was how things worked out. Now, maybe politeness is not the greatest thing in the world. I'm a Sunday school teacher, so we tend to value, politeness maybe more than we should. But I do think it's pretty clear that things have gotten kind of out of hand in our political system. When we've reached the point where every single rally the president holds, no matter who he's, fighting against, the people are chanting, lock him up or lock her up, all the time. We're not in a well-working political system, and it seems to be, passing down the line to other races too, people starting to behave in the same kind of ways. So I think that would be a real benefit. I've watched it operate up in Maine for the last couple of cycles, and it seems to be working well and having that effect, and it definitely did in Cambridge. I will say this, it was really fun in Cambridge when they did it, because back then, before they had computer programs for it, you just filled out a paper ballot. And so you literally had to do the part, it took a week to count them. There was you'd use a high school gymnasium, and there'd be 200 people, mostly women, who would be there, and they would count the ballots. They'd eliminate the bottom one, and then they'd pick them up the piles and move them physically around the auditorium and redistribute the votes. And it was really good, because all the candidates for city council would stand there and watch for a week while this was going on. And the wounds of the campaign, inevitable wounds would be kind of knit up in the process of just that playing out. You don't get to do that anymore because you have the computer. Computers have made some things like Zoom better and some other things not better. That's the world we live in. But I think overall, it's a good idea, this stuff. And I'm really hopeful that Massachusetts is about to be a kind of springboard to its further adoption.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I concur with you. And there's a lot of excitement around the campaign and a lot of grassroots energy that's tied in with the campaign. And we'll see what happens next week. The question is, someone had a question in the chat, and I want to get to that in a second. But the question is, where do you see the future of the climate justice movement going? And then it's part A to that is, how do you see climate resiliency factoring into that? So part A, where do you see the climate justice movement going, or where are you hopeful that it will go? And part B, where do you see climate resilience factoring into that?
Well, I'll tell you, I think that young people are doing a fantastic job at the moment in providing real leadership. And I got to say, the thing that interests me most over the next decade or two is figuring out how to make sure that we have a large number of older Americans who are fully lined up side by side with this. I think that's sometimes the least aggressively engaged part of our population, though there's plenty of remarkable advocates and people doing all kinds of work. I'm going to try and do some organizing there, and I hope that we're able to, because I think that might be a big help. And I do think that resilience is going to be an important part of this, because what choice are we going to have? Every year with it brings with it a higher toll of storm, of fire, and one of the ways that we're going to have to really start thinking about this is that people are going to be on the move. People are going to be on the move internally in this country. People are already starting to vacate some of those parts of coastal, the Gulf Coast and things so far this year, Lake Charles, Louisiana has been hit by 6 hurricanes. At a certain point, you're just like, okay, how many times are you going to set up the pins in the bowling alley again, And so people are going to be on the move, and certainly that's already true around the world. The UN estimates that we could be seeing, their high estimate is 1 billion climate refugees by the latter part of this century. So 1 in 7, 1 in 8 human beings on the move. Think about that. There's no way to have a stable world, but we can't, obviously we can't just build walls or, put people in cages. We're going to have to come up with some kind of ethic, in large part because, it's us and our carbon that put people on the move in the first place. So I think these are going to be really key parts of this discussion going forward. And so resilience above all, yes, it's going to be a matter of walls and dikes and, so on and so forth, but mostly it's going to be a matter of societies that learn how to take care of people, that start valuing somewhat different things than we've been valuing at the moment. My guess is that our societies will put a lot less premium on growth going forward and a lot more premium on security and stability and resilience, that these will become things that we prize in the ways that we've prized growth in the last 6 or 7 decades.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What the work that we do at Crew, and then we want to go into Q&A, is something, you said, is that because these extreme weather events will continue to happen, we believe that social connectedness, social solidarity, social resilience is climate resilience. So we have teams and our idea is to have teams and localized neighborhoods that work together, and with people can get an opportunity to know their neighbors and realize that we are in this together. It was Bishop Desmond Tutu, Bishop out of South Africa. He said, "My humanity is bound up in your humanity, for we can only be human together." And I think that as we start to realize that we're all interconnected, I think that will raise the value and how we look at each other. I think that may prevent police officers from killing Black and brown bodies. But obviously, white supremacy needs to be challenged. I'm from Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, and unfortunately, there was just a killing of a young man the other day by a white police officer in broad daylight, a few white police officers. So there's a lot of protests going on there now because, again, people are tired, particularly those who live in Black and brown communities are tired of voices being silent. And as Dr. King said, rioting is the language of the unheard. And that's why we see a lot of rioting. There are a lot of peaceful protesters down there, but then there are also those who looters, and we don't need looting and polluting. Not only are they polluting, they're looting. So we need them to stop looting and polluting. But ultimately, it's this notion of white supremacy that should be challenged, which devalues the other and uplifts, gain over the other, uplifts individual achievement, and really uplifts capitalism. And because we're living in a capitalistic society in America, folks are not realizing that, our humanity is bound up in each other, but folks have this insular thinking and this parochial way of thinking that, oh, if the issue doesn't happen in my backyard, then it's not of concern to me. But the reality of it is, if it's happening in your community, if it's happening in your neighborhood, if your neighbors got burglarized and your other neighbor got burglarized and that burglar wasn't caught, eventually that burglar may come to your house. So if you see that burglar in broad daylight, maybe you might want to try to not necessarily go intervene, but maybe you want to try to do something, whether that's
our neighborhood at this point extends around the globe. So that's the deal. There's no walls that keep the carbon one place or another. Really true. No, look, the reckoning that's underway around race right now in this country is it's got to happen. And I think maybe there's some signs that it really is starting to happen. The ugliness of the kind of white supremacy stuff is more evident all the time, and the kind of just dumbness of it all, just sort of, I saw a picture or a video of these guys, the Proud Boys that the president was talking about the other day. And listened to him for about 40 seconds and it was like, exactly what are you proud of? Because it's not astonishingly clear just watching you that there's much to be proud of. We're in a tough place, but maybe a place where there's some real growth possible now. I hope that we don't just sort of elect Joe Biden and say, okay, we've done our part and that's it, and on we go. I hope that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for real progress.
Oh, absolutely. Having new political leadership in a direction that's focused on bringing people together, I think will be critical as we move forward into the future, particularly when we're dealing with the coronavirus. The coronavirus has exposed, if it has exposed anything, I think it has exposed how interconnected human beings are. The virus started in Wuhan, China, and traveled across the globe and has affected folks on every continent. And I think the lesson that should teach us that it has not only exacerbated those who were already stressed, communities that were already stressed, frontline workers and who's essential and who's not essential, but that has exposed and exacerbated who has access to quality health care. And oftentimes, those who lack quality or who do not have access to quality health care are the same ones who are disproportionately affected by not only the coronavirus, but the same folks who are disproportionately affected by the extreme weather events that is happening because of climate change. Well, listen, I want to go into some Q&A here while we have you. We have some questions here in the chat. Before folks unmute themselves, we have a question. I'll just read one here. Dr. Michael Mann has said that if Trump wins the election next week, it's game over for the climate. Where should the climate movers focus our efforts in the face of this possible reality?
For the next 120 hours, it should focus its efforts on making sure that Donald Trump doesn't win again. That's key. And then after that, then, we go to work on making sure that Biden said last weekend in a radio broadcast, he said, climate change is the #1 issue facing humanity, and it's my #1 issue. And so our job after Tuesday, if he wins, is to hold him to that and make sure that he takes the whole strong suite of actions he should be taking.
Thank you for that. We want to now take any other questions. If you could, if someone has a question, we'd like to open it up to you to see if you have a question while we have a few minutes remaining on our program. All right, so I see a few different hands. I'm going to go in the order I see them. Let's start with Merle, and then I'm going to go that way. I see you, Judith. I see you. We'll get to you, Judith.
This is a very tough question, but where does population growth and population size fit into the way you view these issues of resilience?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a place where I think we can actually be optimistic. It's one of the few things that people have done a pretty good job with. People in the 1960s and early 1970s really started worrying about population. There were books like The Population Bomb and things. And some of that came from this part of the world, but mostly it was people in the developing world who understood the challenges that they faced across a whole wide suite of issues, just running out of all kinds of things. And they went to work and they figured out what the answer was. When you educate women and empower them to one degree or another, fertility drops like a rock. And the average woman on this planet had 6 children 40 years ago. And that number is now 2.3 and continuing to fall. So look, there's going to be some continuing rise in the total population for another 20 or 30 years as this kind of bulge works its way, but the curve, that curve has definitely been flattened, in a way that the curve of carbon or whatever has not been. And again, it's mostly been by this powerful tool. It just turns out that given some choice in the matter, most women decided they didn't want to have 6 children, and so that was really good.
Thank you for that. We have a question over there by Judith that I think I saw y'all hands raised.
I'd like to introduce you to Timothy Lawrence, who wrote a song that I really want everybody to hear. Go ahead, Timothy. You tell.
Oh, yes, I made a song to support the J-Pods. And I helped Mrs. Judith. And
here's how you find it. You go online and you just put in YouTube, and then you put in solar mobility song, and you're going to hear Timothy singing, and he put together the pictures, and it is beautiful and short.
I will go find it right away. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I don't know if we have time for a song, but if you have a question, that'd be great. But I don't think we have time for a song.
Go listen to it online.
Put it on YouTube.
I would like to comment on something that you were saying earlier about education of women and the increase or the decrease of the population. I think that was a very good statement, because I have noticed that from the beginning, when women's rights first started in the late 1800s to today's time, the less educated women were, the more babies were created. The more educated that they became, the less babies were created, because they had goals and ambitions, in my opinion, as well. And now
He
that
doesn't
we,
have much time.
oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I just enjoyed what you just said just a second ago, and I don't believe we'll ever be going back to those times, whereas then babies were popping out at 6 and 7.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, dear brother. Were there any other questions? I can see your hand raised. All right, I see Evan hand.
Hello. This is so exciting. I also put my question in the chat, so I'm just going to read it there because I think I typed it more eloquently than I could speak it. But basically, I'm studying climate resiliency and have noticed, and like the narratives of that, and have noticed an emergent body of work critiquing resilience thinking as kind of like this neoliberal framework, basically saying, like, as of course a simplification, that the more resilient a population, the more stress they can be subjected to and kind of just like left out on their own without the helps of like government or other kind of entities. And I was just wondering if you could speak to how we can in practice transform, not necessarily preserve, our communities to be able to bounce forward, not bounce back, but forward into a more just future that can grapple with the effects of climate change effectively.
So first of all, let me just say that it's such a remarkable thing for me to hear that it's even possible to like go study climate resiliency, and that there are books to read and, you know, discussions to have and all of this. I mean, because this is new and very good and very powerful. So look, you know, all questions about communities and what happens to them are ultimately questions about power and who has it and who doesn't. So anything that gives communities more power allows them to have more control over the outcome of whatever's going on. One of the reasons that I really like renewable energy is because it produces less carbon. But the other reason I really like it is because it takes power that currently exists, you know, with the king of Saudi Arabia or the Koch brothers or someone like that, and distributes it much closer to home, so that communities have some chance, since everybody has some sun and some wind, but not everybody has some coal or gas or oil, gives them some chance at power and what you can do with it. So, I mean, in the end, you know, that's, you know, figuring out how to build societies that devolve more power, particularly economic and political power, to communities, puts them less at the mercy both of the physical elements and of the political winds that blow, you know.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap this program up. There's no, if I don't see any hands, we could, any final thoughts, Bill, before you depart? Bill has an event with Senator Ed Markey here in Massachusetts, so he's had an event he has to get ready to go to. But any final thoughts, Bill? I'm sorry.
Sure. I'm looking forward to going and talking with Senator Markey, just because I so enjoyed watching young people propel his. There was something quite wonderful about watching a bunch of 19 and 22-year-olds, you know, pull this 78-year-old or whatever he is over the finish line in the Senate primary. And it was really nice to see. And that somehow he became the charismatic candidate, not the Kennedy, was one of the funnier twists of fate in a long time. And trust me on this, nobody in Washington missed the lesson of that primary, which was that running on the Green New Deal and climate change proved to be an absolutely first-class ticket to a real upset. Everybody, people in Washington may not know a lot about a lot of things, but the one thing they all are experts in is getting elected. And so they were paying close attention to what was going on there. And that was a big deal. So many thanks to people who helped with that, and many thanks to all you helping with every part of these fights everywhere. You know, I mean, the thing about the thing about this climate fight is that unlike other fights, we don't actually know if we're going to win or not, because of this time element. You know, it's you know, it's not like the way that, you know, Dr. King would always say, we're going to get there eventually. I may not get there. I may not get to cross the Jordan, but that's where we're going, and that's where we'll end up. And that was good because it gave people a lot of courage. We don't know that because time is the variable here, but do know that you have, and I know this because I've spent my life traveling the world now working on this, you have innumerable brothers and sisters in every corner of the planet who are taking up this fight too, and they're paying attention to what you're doing and are grateful for it, just as I know you are grateful for what Aboriginal people in Australia are doing to fight coal mines, or people in low-lying Pacific Islands are doing to draw attention to what's going on, or you know, a million other examples. You know, we're in this together, and it's going to be a fight, and we'll find out. You know, we'll live long enough to see what the outcome is, almost all of us, because the next 10 years are going to tell the story. So if you know anybody who's been keeping their powder dry for some reason, now's the moment. It's our last chance, last decade, I think, with really high leverage over the outcome of things. So I am really grateful. And now I've got two tasks for the evening. One is to help Senator Markey turn people out to vote. And the other is to go to YouTube and type in solar mobility so we can hear what Tim has to
Solar
say.
mobility song. Solar mobility song.
Got it.
Okay.
Reverend Walker, thank you so much for
you.
inviting me, and thank you for all your work and the work of crew and everybody. Just we'll keep it all together through Tuesday night, and we get, with any luck, one night off to you know, raise a glass and then back to work. So thank you all immensely.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We will get this video out. It has been recorded. You know, I hope that you all stay smooth and cool these next 5 days and do what you can, if you can, with what you can and what you have. If you know friends who haven't voted, please encourage them to vote their conscience. Again, thank you, Bill. Thank you all. We will get this recording, and we will see y'all later, and y'all stay safe. And the good Lord keep you is my prayer. Thank you.